Good morning. A quorum being present, the subcommittee will come to order. We welcome to the subcommittee each of you. This is our second opportunity in the 112th Congress to examine the safety of America's miners. The loss of life last month in an Idaho silver mine, as well as the mining tragedy at Upper Big Branch, are reminders of the need to remain vigilant in our efforts to promote mine safety. Over the last year, the Mine Safety and Health Administration has proposed a number of changes to mine safety enforcement. Changes include reestablishing pre-shift examinations for safety and health violations and a new emergency rock dusting standard. The administration has also proposed significant changes to the regulations that govern when a mine is deemed to be in a pattern of violation. While it has often failed exercising all the enforcement tools at its disposal, MSHA is to be commended for taking action. In fact, just last month, the administration, for the first time in its 40-year history, placed 2 mines in pattern of violations status. Additionally, due to the work of the committee and dedicated journalists, the public is finally able to take a look at internal audits that reveal more information about MSHA's enforcement procedures. There are still a number of questions surrounding MSHA's recent proposals, and we hope to get some answers today. Most importantly, we want to determine whether these changes will produce the safety results we hope to achieve. That's why the testimony from today's witnesses is so important. Our witnesses have more than 100 years of combined mine safety experience, and their professional expertise and personal knowledge will help inform Congress about the current state of mine safety enforcement, whether MSHA, in their opinion, is on the right track, and what other tools are needed to safeguard the health and well-being of miners. We also plan to review whether there are examples of federal laws or regulations hindering proactive efforts on the job site that may lead to better safety conditions. Washington cannot have all the answers. I can't believe I made that statement, Mr. Chairman.
The longer you're here, the truer.
But I truly believe that. And may I reiterate, Washington cannot have all the answers, and it should not stand in the way of an employer's effort to go above and beyond the law in providing a safe work environment. Punishment is important, but putting punishment before prevention is not in the best interest of America's workers. As Mr. Roberts has noted in the past, most of the mining industry does the right thing. Let's ensure federal policies hold bad actors accountable and partner with the good actors on behalf of worker safety. An example of this kind of collaborative effort is the successful development and deployment of coal dust explosibility meters, or CDM. The device developed by the Federal National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health takes real-time samples of rock dust to help determine its combustibility. Previously, MSHA laboratories could take weeks to examine a rock dust sample. Now miners have a useful tool on site that immediately enhances safety. Advancing strong mine safety protections is a goal that we all share and one we must all work to achieve. Miners work under extreme conditions to provide the natural resources our nation needs, and they deserve our support. Policymakers, enforcement officials, and mine operators each play an important role in helping to ensure miners go home to their families at the end of their shift. As I noted at our last mine safety hearing, worker safety is best advanced when we work together, and I hope we are capable of doing so. At this time, I would like to recognize my colleague from California, Lynn Woolsey, the senior Democratic member of the subcommittee, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this very important hearing. It's been 13 months since the Upper Big Branch disaster, yet Congress has failed to act on repeated requests from the Mine Safety and Health Administration, from MSHA. Miners and their families have asked also, and they want us to modernize the Mine Safety Act. MSHA has repeatedly asked our assistance because they need better tools to protect all miners. They need changes to a dysfunctional pattern of violations provision, stronger sanctions to penalize mine operators who provide advance notice, and basics like subpoena authority. Following MSHA's March 3rd testimony, which outlined the need and justification for legislation to modernize the Mine Act, Mr. Miller, Mr. Rahal, and I reintroduced comprehensive mine safety legislation on April the 15th. It largely mirrors the Robert C. Byrd Mine Safety Protection Act that was brought to the floor last year, and it contains the reforms that MSHA has requested. 1 year ago, on May 24th, in Beckley, West Virginia, this committee heard from the governor of West Virginia and the families of miners who were killed at Massey's Upper Big Branch mine. Gary Quarles, a miner who lost his son, testified that it was common for Massey Energy to provide advance notice of inspections to miners underground under the current Mine Act, and that classified as criminal misdemeanor. Misdemeanors tend to receive scant attention from prosecutors. In fact, not one advance notice violation has been criminally prosecuted since 1977, even though MSHA inspectors have had to seize phones at mines to prevent tip-offs. MSHA has secured injunctions, but the obstruction of justice continues because there is so little consequence to flaunting the law. We look forward to hearing from our witnesses on whether they support strengthening this provision. We would also like to hear whether our witnesses think miners who raise concerns about safety are adequately protected against retaliation under existing law. In Beckley, we learned that miners were fearful of making safety complaints because it was made very clear to them that their jobs would be on the line if they did. Alice Peters, whose son-in-law, Edward Jones, was killed in that explosion, testified that he complained at least 7 times about ventilation problems, but his supervisors told him that he would lose his job if he caused the mine to stop production. Dean was trapped. His son had cystic fibrosis, and he needed the job for health insurance. Of course, retaliation is not confined to West Virginia. In 2007, a miner in Kentucky showed video of leaking underground seals to MSHA. It took 3 years of litigation, hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, just to get the operator to pull the disciplinary letter from the employee's file. We will be asking our witnesses whether MSHA should reform the badly broken pattern of violations process to provide for timely sanctions when any mine operator, whether it is coal, metal, or stone, chronically violates mine safety standards. Or should miners continue to be endangered while serial recidivists appeal citations for years on end before MSHA can act? Finally, Mr. Chairman, we would like to learn if the coal industry is adopting modern technologies such as coal dust explosivity meters to help prevent disasters, and whether Congress needs to take action, as we did in the Miner Act, to speed the modernization of mine safety and bring that act into the 21st century. I look forward to hearing from each of our witnesses. What a great panel we have. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, all members will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the permanent hearing record. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow questions for the record, statements, and extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official record. It's now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished witness, Louis Griesmer, and I hope I pronounced that right. Am I close? Okay, thank you. Louis Griesmer is President and CEO of Springfield Underground Incorporated. Mr. Griesmer has more than 30 years of experience in aggregate industry After earning his engineering degree from Washington University in St. Louis, he began working full-time for his family's aggregate business as safety director and mine planner. Mr. Griesmer is a past chairman of the National Sand, Stone, and Gravel Association's Board of Directors. Mr. Griesmer is testifying today on behalf of National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association. Mark Ellis is president of the Industrial Minerals Association North America, which is the principal trade association representing the industrial minerals industry in North America. Mr. Ellis has unique experience, having served as an attorney with the Federal Mine Safety and Health Review Commission and as a senior policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Labor at MSHA. Mr. Ellis is a graduate of the University of Denver College of Law and its College of Business Administration. Cecil Roberts Jr. is president of the United Mine Workers of America. Mr. Roberts held a variety of jobs within the coal mines of West Virginia before becoming a full-time union activist. He was appointed to serve as a member of the West Virginia University Institute for Labor Studies and Research Advisory Board in 1996. Mr. Roberts graduated from West Virginia Technical College and in 1997 received an honorary doctorate in humanities from West Virginia University of Technology. Anthony Bumbibko is Vice President of Safety with Arch Coal Incorporated, one of the largest coal producers in the United States. Mr. Bumbibko directs the health and safety functions for each of Arch's subsidiary companies, which operate in 6 states and employs over 4,700 individuals. Mr. Bumbibko was an underground coal miner for 7 years. Mr. Bumbibko is testifying on behalf of the National Mining Association, and I welcome each of you. We'll start with Mr. Griesmer. Thank you for being part of our witness panel.
Thank you, Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Woolsey, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify on behalf of the National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association on worker safety and health. Also, we gratefully acknowledge this committee's work of last summer and the work of dedicated staff to focus mine safety reform on areas of greatest risk. I am Louis Griesmer, president of Springfield Underground in Springfield, Missouri. Springfield Underground was established by my father in 1946. I myself am an MSHA certified safety trainer and got my start in the aggregates business in our safety department. I know our employees personally. They are committed to their work and they are committed to safety on the job. The National Stone, Sand, and Gravel Association represents the crushed stone, sand, and gravel or construction aggregates industries. Its member companies produce more than 90% of the crushed stone and more than 70% of the sand and gravel consumed annually in the United States. There are 10,000 aggregates operations in the United States, and 70% of the nation's counties are home to an aggregates operation. The crushed stone, sand, and gravel industry has long been committed to the safest and most healthful possible production of aggregates. This has resulted in the safest period in our sector's history. This was the 10th year in a row in which our sector achieved a lower injury rate than in the prior year. Our workplace safety enhancements have come from constant efforts to train and remind employees of dangers they need to avoid. However, it seems that MSHA is so focused. We believe that MSHA should work more with us on programs that help instill in employees genuine respect for the precautions that MSHA and the companies require to ensure they return home safe every night. Our industry CEOs have met several times with MSHA's leadership in an effort to work collaboratively to reduce injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. Of increasing frustration to NSSGA members, however, is what the aggregates industry believes is inconsistent and unpredictable enforcement. A review of data shows that while injury rates continue to fall, there has been a substantial increase in citations labeled significant and substantial. It is only sensible to ask, why is this happening and how can this be fair? We believe a more enlightened approach would be more effective in achieving positive results. The issuance of citations for each apparent discrepancy, no matter how unlikely it would ever contribute to a hazard, heightens frustration and inhibits collaboration. After all, only 3 years ago did the agency for this first time complete 100% of the annual 2 inspections of surface and 4 inspection of underground facilities mandated in the Act. This was well after our industry had begun its decade-long string of yearly reductions in injury rates. So for some, the 2 inspections for surface and 4 for underground operations may be appropriate, but for others, it may not be the best use of resources. This is especially true, we believe, given the severe budgetary constraints on the federal government and the ongoing economic slowdown. Moreover, if MSHA's resources are limited or reduced, we contend that a reduction in the number of inspections is preferable to reductions in compliance assistance, training, and other areas that are helping industry improve safety. We would be pleased to work with MSHA and representatives of miners to update approaches to regulation and enforcement of mine safety. Furthermore, a specific point, we believe that modernization would be achieved if MSHA would establish a pattern of compliance program, which would give some form of credit to operators for outstanding adherence to MSHA standards and keeping low injury rates. It is anticipated that this would help the agency streamline and improve the efficiency of the inspection process, thus freeing resources to be targeted at areas of greatest risk. Ideas for this include providing credit for excellent compliance so that future citation assessments can see financial costs mitigated, allowing inspectors to issue a notice in lieu of citation for de minimis standard and or elimination of citation if immediate abatement is accomplished by the operator, and developing guidelines for inspectors directing that they focus their inspection hours on the most troubled operations. And if MSHA is interested in safety and health management systems as reflected in the impending June rulemaking proposal on this matter, then perhaps MSHA could at least provide an incentive to operators, especially small ones, by granting credits against other enforcement actions, such as reduced civil penalties in the manner described above for abatement credits. We respectfully urge in the effort to modernize mine safety that more be done in the area of assisting operators in compliance, allowing optimal resources to be focused on the areas of greatest risk. Thank you. That concludes my statement, and I would be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Ellis.
Chairman Walberg, Member Woolsey,
Turn your mic on, please.
Thank you. Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Woolsey, members of the subcommittee. I'm Mark Ellis, President of the Industrial Minerals Association North America, also known as IMANA. IMANA represents companies that extract and process a vital and beneficial group of raw materials known as industrial minerals. Industrial minerals are the feedstocks for many of the products we take for granted, such as glass, ceramics, plastics, paper, and building products. It is the unique chemical and physical properties imparted by these minerals which make them valuable. Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting the industrial minerals industry to testify today. Our sector often is forgotten in the attention paid to other, more familiar mine products. In many ways, the low profile of our industry is a testament to our ability to extract and process minerals using safe and responsible methods. My message to you today is threefold. First, the safety of America's miners is the paramount responsibility of all who work in the mining industry. Second, I ask that we all spend some time today rethinking what initiatives will modernize mine safety. Finally, please recognize that not all mining is the same. The industrial minerals industry is proud of our contributions to reducing both the number and, more importantly, the rate of mining-related deaths, injuries, and illnesses. But let us not lose sight of the fact that the measure of our success is the safety and health of the mining workforce. There is absolutely nothing more important than sending miners home safe and healthy at the end of each day. Mr. Chairman, if I were to ask you what the leading cause of injury is in the industrial minerals industry, what would you guess? Explosions, lung disease, falling rocks, or mobile equipment? In fact, ergonomic and musculoskeletal injuries represent 87% of the injuries in our industry. I can't say that the industrial minerals industry has eliminated all non-ergonomic hazards in the workplace, just as I can't say we've eliminated all unsafe behaviors, but our injury statistics are telling us something, and we're responding to that message. We want to address what is injuring our miners, so what have we done? We've partnered with the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, supported its research, and provided a variety of products to address ergonomic hazards in the mining industry. Our companies are responding. They're evaluating their workplaces for ergonomic hazards, they're training their mine personnel to eliminate unsafe behaviors, and they're installing controls. And they're preventing injuries, all without a single legislative or regulatory action. Yet another example of proactivity are member companies that mine and process 99% pure crystalline silica have developed a voluntary occupational health program that goes far beyond regulatory requirements, represents thousands of hours of work by dedicated professionals, and no doubt is the primary cause for the virtual elimination of silicosis, the world's oldest occupational disease, from their workplaces. The companies do this not because the law requires it, but because it's the right thing to do. This leads me to my second point, Mr. Chairman. It's time to rethink the types of initiatives that will modernize mine safety. We acknowledge that there have been recent preventable tragedies in the mining industry that only stand to highlight the need for continued vigilance. However, we believe that the mining industry is not in need of legislative reform, and that the Mine Safety and Health Administration already has the statutory and regulatory authority it needs to compel compliance with the law by recalcitrant mine operators. This has been demonstrated recently by MSHA's utilization of its injunctive relief authority and its decision to finally begin placing mines on a pattern of violation status. MSHA should focus its resources and the power it already possesses where it's needed most. IMA urges Congress and the Department of Labor to leverage the existing safety programs currently being utilized by the mining industry. We believe that America's miners would benefit greatly by implementing a program based on public-private partnerships. For instance, a program similar to OSHA's Voluntary Protection Program, and doing so would be a more efficient use of MSHA's resources. It's important to note that not all mining is the same. The non-metallic mineral sector of the mining industry simply does not present the same degree of hazard as other sectors. No fatality is acceptable. But we note that between 2003 and 2009, our fatality rate averaged nearly 80% less than the sector with the highest rate. We also should note that the non-metal sector in the past has achieved the universally pursued goal of 0 fatalities, most recently in 2006. In conclusion, modernizing mine safety is an ongoing activity, and the best results are achieved through collaboration between industry and government. Regulatory compliance and reasonable enforcement still is necessary. However, the measure of our success is not the number or the severity of the enforcement actions taken against mine operators, but the safety and health of the mining workforce. We also need to be prepared to recognize and acknowledge superior mine safety performance as readily as we condemn unacceptable performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ellis. Mr. Roberts, welcome.
Well, thank you for having us here today. I appreciate this opportunity to speak on behalf of the coal miners that we represent, and quite frankly, many of the coal miners and other miners across this country we don't represent. I'm also here today not only as the President of United Mine Workers, but I'm also the Chairman of the Health and Safety Committee for the AFL-CIO, and I will be speaking in some of my prepared remarks address non-metal mining as well as coal mining. I think for 100 years, we had no laws in this country, for a lack of a better way of saying it. It wasn't until 1969 that Congress acted and passed laws with enforcement actions by the government. And that was in 1969 after a terrible tragedy at the Farmington No. 9 mine in West Virginia. We still go there every year to honor those who perished, 19 of which are still entombed in that mine. The tragedy was such a horrific nature, all of the miners could not be recovered. But Congress saw fit at that time, and I think the nation demanded, that Congress act to protect the coal miners of this nation. And the question would be, well, does legislation protect coal miners? And I think that's a resounding yes. I think the statistics are very clear with respect to that. If you look at the 40 years prior to the passage of the 1969 Act, 32,000 miners died in this nation's mines, coal miners. 40 years after the passage of the Act, less than 3,200. We averaged 800 fatalities a year prior to the passage of the 1969 Act, and we've obviously done so much better. We passed revisions to the 69 Act in 1977 that brought in metal and non-metal for the same kinds of protections that we afforded coal miners in 1969, and the results were exactly the same. We had a 2/3 reduction in the number of fatalities in metal and non-metal. So it's almost impossible for anyone to argue that Congress acting has not helped protect coal miners and all miners in the United States of America, and continues to do so every single day. We also know that we never recognized black lung, pneumoconiosis, as an occupational disease that was compensable in this nation until 1969. And we also know that 70,000 coal miners have perished in the last 40 years from this terrible disease. So I think the statistics tell us that good laws passed by Congress, laws obeyed, and laws enforced have saved many, many coal miners and other miners' lives in this country. You can't debate that. It's impossible for anyone to argue against that. That's the truth. Some will say, well, things are so much better now. Laws are not written for the people who work hard and try to do the right thing. You're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman. I have said before the United States Senate, as well as the United States House of Representatives, that I believe that somewhere between 90 and 95% of the coal industry is trying very hard to do the right thing. And I would assume that that goes for all of the mining industry. But we have to understand there are people out there who are not doing the right thing. And we cannot ignore that fact. And just yesterday, after 29 miners died a year ago at Massey Energy's Upper Big Branch mine, by the way, I lost friends in that. I lost neighbors in that. I've lost people I knew all my life, played ball with, and or their kids, or their grandkids. So that hit home personally for some of us at the United Mine Workers of America. Just yesterday, at the Randolph Mine, just yesterday, Mr. Chairman, this happened yesterday. Massey did an impact statement at Massey's Randolph Mine and issued 20 withdrawal orders. Miners up into the face without controlling the dust everywhere, 2 different pieces of equipment operating in the same location, all of this in complete violation of the laws that this Congress has written to protect coal miners. If we do not have strong enforcement of the laws that Congress writes, Congress should not write laws because they're useless if they're not protecting the coal miners in this nation. And I applaud what MSHA has done with the impact inspections. The other thing we do, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, need to do a couple of things. I think Congress should be given a lot of credit for what they did in 2006. The one thing that I can report to you today, if the Sago mine disaster had occurred yesterday, we'd have had 1 fatality instead of 12 because of the actions that Congress took in 2006. You took actions to say that shelters have to be in mines. At the time the 06 legislation was being debated, many in the industry said, well, we can't comply with this. It won't work. It costs too much money. But I can tell you there's a shelter in every single coal mine in the United States where it's equivalent. And one of the things that we did find from the Upper Big Branch explosion, the shelter that was in place there withstood the explosion, water accumulated, and it did not destroy that shelter. And many of the people in the industry came here and says, well, you know what's going to happen. If you put these shelters in the mines, they're going to be destroyed in explosions. The miners won't have any place to go. And unfortunately, the Upper Big Branch miners had no place to go. They were killed almost instantly. And if they had had the opportunity to live for 15 minutes, they could have saved their lives by making their way to one of these shelters. So I applaud the actions of Congress for the actions they've taken in 1969, in 1977, in 2006, and I look forward to applauding the action Congress takes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Bumbico, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm Tony Bumbico, Vice President of Safety for Arch Coal. I'm appearing today on behalf of the National Mining Association and as a representative of Arch. Arch is our nation's 2nd largest coal company with operations in 6 states. We have 4,700 employees at our underground and surface mines. In 2010, we mined over 160 million tons of coal while achieving the lowest injury rate among our nation's diversified coal producers. While we're proud, we're not satisfied. Injuries still occur at our operations, and we won't be satisfied until we reach 0 injuries. I began my career in 1974 as an underground miner. I was a member of the United Mine Workers of America and later elected to a position on the union's executive board. For the last 25 years, I've performed various management functions, during which I've always been dedicated to promoting health and safety. During my career, the coal industry has made significant progress, but the industry can and must continue to improve its safety performance. In the time I have, I want to talk about the efforts underway at NMA to modernize mine safety and about the specific efforts underway at ARCH. In 2007, NMA initiated an effort to identify barriers to safe performance and to disseminate best practice materials. This effort began with an examination of the industry safety performance. NMA has studied companies with exemplary safety performance and identified certain common elements. Effective safety processes tend to be performance-based, integrated into a comprehensive management system. They are supported by senior management and encourage employee involvement. In NMA's estimation, these are the elements necessary to modernize health and safety in the U.S. mining industry. Leadership and culture are the characteristics that have guided ARCH's effort to modernize safety. These characteristics have had a positive impact on safety throughout the mining industry. At ARCH, safety is a core value. Our goal is to reach the perfect zero. Historically, ARCH's safety performance has been solid. In 2010, for example, our total incident rate, which measures lost time and medical injuries, improved to 1.1. That represents a 76% improvement since 1998. We didn't achieve this level of performance overnight. Our safety process when I arrived at ARCH in 2004 began with the requirement that each operation meet minimum corporate standards. These standards were set forth as safety principles incorporated in division safety plans adopted by each operation. In 2004, we implemented a continuous safety improvement process to focus on identifying and closing measurable gaps in safety performance. That same year, we also started conducting cross-operational safety audits, where we have people from different operations evaluate the core safety processes at their sister mines. In 2006, not satisfied with our pace of improvement, we adopted behavior-based safety as the vehicle to drive our safety performance to the next level. Every ARCH operation has implemented a BBS process using steering teams to support their improvement efforts. The steering teams develop a list of critical behaviors with the potential to contribute to injuries. These critical behaviors serve as the basis for a peer-to-peer safety observation process. In a nutshell, BBS is a no-name, no-blame process that moves beyond the use of injury trends to identify safety performance. BBS is about encouraging employees to avoid exposing themselves to risk and sharing information about the exposures they encounter. It teaches miners about the concept of safety. Understanding the concept of safety improves a miner's ability to recognize risks, respond appropriately, and helps to build an effective safety culture. It's been 5 years since we implemented BBS, and we're seeing positive trends. Our total incident rate has improved 57%. Exposures have been reduced by over 120,000 peer-to-peer safety observations. And over 3,100 specific barriers to safe performance have been identified and eliminated. BBS has helped our employees understand the concept of safety, but it's not the only tool available to modernize mine safety. We've come to recognize that modernizing mine safety requires leadership, culture, training, and involvement, characteristics that don't result from writing more safety rules or enforcing them more stringently. Mr. Chairman, in my written testimony, I will also discuss application of the Voluntary Protection Program to modernizing mine safety, but in the interest of time, I'll defer on that issue. In closing, I think it's critical that we all recognize that to improve safety performance, we need to move beyond a model based strictly on enforcement. Enforcement is necessary, particularly with bad actors, but to truly modernize mine safety, we have to develop performance structures that engage all stakeholders in problem-solving manner. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll be happy to answer your questions.
I thank each of you for your testimony, and now we'll move to questions from the panel here, and I look forward to beginning. Mr. Griesmer, in your written testimony, you cite examples of MSHA inspectors lacking consistency in their citation process. I've personally heard many illustrations and examples of how an inspector will write a violation for something that another inspector said was acceptable only months prior. I also hear of inspections that result in high numbers of citations that go on to be found to have no merit. You suggest that this problem of inconsistency may stem from cross-training inspectors in various sectors of jurisdiction. Do you believe the inconsistencies found in this citation process result from inspectors inserting a great deal of subjectivity to the citation process rather than using objective standards?
Mr. Chairman, I believe that there's an effort by MSHA to be consistent, but I believe there's let me give you a couple of examples. I just had a couple citations a week ago at our open pit plant in Joplin, Missouri, and I think they pretty much illustrate some of the issues that small operators like myself are dealing with. And one of these citations is justifiable. One of our stockpile truck drivers dismounted his machine after setting the parking brake, left the machine unattended for a couple of minutes, and then came back. Under the rules to live by, we are now very focused on chalking wheels for heavy equipment like that, and what he did was not appropriate. But this is a shifting standard. I think we could say 10 years ago that may not have been a citation. But today we're focused on powered haulage, which is responsible for, I think last year it was 7 deaths and injuries. So we have to raise the bar, and I'm in agreement with that. The problem is I went out to that plant in the fall and instructed our miners that this is an initiative, this is something we have to comply with. We supply the wheel chocks, we supplied the training, but it's still one of those patterns, those patterns of behavior that have to be adjusted. That was a 7-year employee, stockpile truck driver doing his job and making that decision as to whether he was going to be off that truck long enough to chock the wheels. This resulted in a citation that is a significant and substantial citation with possibility of a fatality being highly likely. An instance of what will be a contested violation is we were cited on a maintenance truck that was located at the plant. The backup alarm on it could not be heard above the surrounding noise levels. This maintenance truck had a backup alarm, but the inspector decided it wasn't loud enough. We took that back to the shop and determined that backup alarm was above the 85 decibel levels that would require hearing protection. I don't know where to go with that kind of a citation because everybody is correct in that instance. It couldn't be heard above the ambient noise levels, but then you're going to require the operators to wear hearing protection. You're not going to hear
Cover
the
against it.
alarm.
Yeah.
So these are specific examples. This happened on April 26th of this year. These are the things that the small operators are having to deal with and trying to comply with this type of enforcement, which we feel like is not necessarily appropriate to our type of operations. We would need more help. We would suggest that rather than spending the resources on more inspections and heavy-handed enforcement, that more assistance be given to small operators so that we can change the behavior of our employees when there's this kind of raising of the bar of what's expected as far as safe behavior.
Okay, appreciate that. Mr. Ellis, in your written testimony, you discuss use of technology. I think that's laying in front of you here. Maybe you could describe that and describe why that isn't receiving wide usage.
I'd be pleased to, Mr. Chairman.
You have a short period of time here, but do your best you can.
Understood. This device was developed in concert between one of our member companies, their workforce, and the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. These are producers of crystalline silica, which is a potential cause of silicosis, a deadly or disabling lung disease. What this device does is it combines two different technologies and merges them together. There's a video camera that's mounted to that hard hat, and the wearer of the hard hat then can show every thing he's looking at or working on. Also involved in here is a sampling device that extracts respirable dust of a certain size, 10 micrometers or less. And that's fed into a particle counter, which then measures what that miner's exposure is. And so as this person is wearing this device, eventually the two technologies are merged that produce a video in real time that shows what the miner's doing as well as what his respirable dust exposure is. And it's particularly well suited for people that do a variety of tasks around a mine, like somebody involved in maintenance, where they're checking here and then they're moving off to another location. We can identify where high exposures are and then look at trying to modify either work practices or institute control technologies to control those exposures.
Okay. Well, I wish I had more time to question, but I got to abide by my own rules, at least to a point here. So I'll turn the questioning over now to the gentlelady from California, Ranking Member Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can go around again, you know. Mr. Roberts laid it out. Safety laws and regulations do make a difference, have made a difference, and workforces are safer because of OSHA and MSHA, period. Mr. Bumiko, you supported it in your testimony. You said virtually the same thing, and I really, really respect that. So the question is, how do we look at where we were 40 years ago, where do we need to be now? And what does modernizing mean? Because we are not in the 21st century. Ergonomics, who even knew the word 40 years ago when we started with this whole thing? So we have a lot to work to do. And it's very clear that employers, let's assume every employer here and most employers do the right thing. So the question is, what are we going to do to protect the workers at the work sites where there are what we call bad actors that repeat and continue to do the same things over and over? Because you see, when we have voluntary compliance, voluntary safety, then the companies that play by the rules voluntarily spend more money to take care of their workers. It's not a level playing field then for the competition. The guys that don't do it, everything's cheaper for them. So that's not right for you either. So the question is, what do we do? And so I'm going to ask you first, Cecil, what is your response to the industry arguments that counting citations instead of final orders unfairly deprives them of due process?
I think that speaks directly to the pattern of violations. If you go back to 1989, the UMWA was concerned about this, and I think there's testimony on record here that we suggested that if you only use final orders, which means that this entire process has taken place on appeals, and we know there are 19,000 cases backed up as we speak. So let's think about that for a moment. And I hate to continue using Upper Big Branch as an example, but the violations that Upper Big Branch had on appeal, some of which are sitting at the review board now, and they had not been finally adjudicated, and they may not have been for another year, and assume that the mine had not had the terrible tragedy that it did, but we would still be trying to adjudicate some of those citations. And the very first thing that most in the public and most in Congress said immediately upon the explosion was, why didn't the government close down this operation? The way the system is working right now is that if you can't, get under a pattern of violations until the final order is issued, you would have had a problem in 2008. The final orders might have been adjudicated in 2010. You may have corrected the problem by 2010, but people were in jeopardy in 2008. The system simply isn't working. And I think we have to decide, do we want to protect the nation's coal miners, or do we want to have an opportunity for the appeal process and fairness to the coal industry itself? I think we have to come down on the side of protecting the coal miners. And I think if we had Upper Big Branch to do over, everyone around here would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Bumbiko. So, okay, let's keep going with this. What does NMA have what are their thoughts on proposals to enable MSHA to place bad actors on POVs, or do they think the status quo works?
We agree with the concept of pattern of violation and the need to ferret out operators that aren't playing by the rules. I think what we disagree is the method with which MSHA would propose to go about enforcing that.
How would you go about it?
With regard to the final orders, I think I would call to the subcommittee's attention the fact that 20% of the S&S violations that are contested end up getting modified. And if you look at more elevated orders like 104Ds, that over 30% get modified. In addition, I think that what you're seeing within the industry right now is an influx of a lot of new inspectors. And in a recent survey—
Well, you said all that, the training and all that. We don't fund MSHA, so what are we going to do? I mean, if I were you, I'd be sitting there saying, get us the best inspectors we can, train them, and make sure they're out there, and we will support that investment.
I think the biggest fault that we had with the previous way that pattern of violation was operated is that the type of changes that MSHA was requesting weren't the type of process changes that would lead to long-term safety improvement.
Well,
they were safety awareness programs that might be a quick fix and lead to a short-term result, but in terms of long-term continuous improvement, they weren't insisting on those type of changes.
On short-term, but we're talking about the long-term patterns of violations that are going to eventually end up in a very serious situation like Massey. And that's what we're going after the bad actors first.
Thank you. Gentlelady's time has expired. We'll move on to the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Bombico, sort of picking up the general theme here, it seems to me that the industry was pretty supportive of the Miner Act in 2006, and Mr. Roberts has indicated the union support of that legislation. And yet, I'm pretty sure that the industry has not been that supportive of S-Miner or the Miner Safety and Health Act. Can you kind of explain why that is, why it's support of one and what's the problem with the others as we're looking at what we might do in this committee and the full committee in Congress in light of the Upper Big Branch tragedy? What are your concerns? What's the difference?
I think the difference is that in 2006, there was a pretty equal playing field and a lot of give and take on the various stakeholders. And in the most recent attempt to look at legislation, there were a number of companies that attempted to enter into discussions, but we weren't able to satisfy the concerns we had. And some of the concerns we had were, one, there were a number of items that were in that bill that in effect could have been done anyway by MSHA. And in fact, if you look at the rock dust standard, if you look at the pattern of violation, there were a number of things there that MSHA has moved forward on without the need for legislation. In addition to that, there were some provisions in that bill, such as the changing definition of S&S citations that would have made it extremely difficult for any violation not to have been an S&S. So those were issues that kind of hung up the process. I think, the biggest concern that we have is that the average frontline supervisor right now has over 300 pages of regulations in the code of regulations that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think we'd be better served to try to improve the way that they understand and deal with what's on the books now than creating additional legislation.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Bombico, for another question, kind of shifting and thinking about how different countries have different approaches. And Australia, for example, has a very different approach that I assume that you're familiar with in their risk management. Can you explain for all of us here the differences and what you like or don't like about those differences?
Well, the fundamental difference is the difference between prescriptive regulations and a requirement that an operator look at the major risks and hazards that they have and come up with ways of dealing with them. Under the Australian model, those mining companies are charged with evaluating their major risks and coming up with procedures, processes that they put in place to deal with them without as much prescriptive regulation on the part of government. In the U.S., we have very detailed prescriptive regulations that deal with things in a 1, 2, 3, 4 progression. And the problem with that is that when you look at a coal mine is a very dynamic, changing environment. And if you focus strictly on prescriptive ways to deal with safety, you kind of lull people into the suspicion that if they do A, B, and C, the D is automatically going to result. I think what we have to get to here in this country is moving the conceptual skills of people from a safety standpoint to a higher level. We have to help miners become better problem solvers, risk identifiers, so that they can deal with the changing environment that they deal with in an underground and a surface coal mine.
So in Australia, for example, the mine operator identifies a risk, assesses a risk, and develops a program to address them, and who oversees that?
They have the oversight from the government, but it's more oversight on what they've put in place to determine whether they're complying with that.
Okay, thank you. I was going to go to Mr. Griesemer and talk about aggregate mining and training, but in compliance with the chairman's rules and my ever desperate hope that we will all comply by the lighting system, I'll yield back.
Thank you for the continuing mentoring, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Now we'll go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Miller.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Mr. Babinko, in response to Chairman Klein's question, your difference on last year's legislation and before is that you say that MSHA has the authority to do this, so you don't. Do you support their effort to go to citations versus final order?
No, I don't.
Do you support their rock dust changes?
Yeah, I believe that there's pretty much a consensus within the industry that what they've done from a rock dust standard standpoint is a good thing.
What would you do about whistleblowers?
Whistleblowers, I believe, at this point have adequate protection under the existing law.
What happened to the person that you fired for showing the video of the leaking water seals?
I think
retaliation against a whistleblower?
I think you're mischaracterizing what occurred there.
You characterize it for me.
Sure. One, I'm not going to talk in a great detail because that issue is currently a matter of civil litigation. But I will say this. The individual in question took a video camera underground and did a tape of seals that were leaking. Instead of calling that to the attention of mine management, or instead of calling MSHA and complaining about the problem, he took the videotape and brought it to a public hearing to show it. And then after the fact, the issue was dealt with.
He never addressed this prior with you, with the company?
No. The individual in question, in fact, was not fired as you characterized it for the action in question. He was laid off in a reduction in force pursuant to the terms of the labor agreement that he was working on.
What is your position on whistleblowers?
I believe whistleblowers should have a protected status under the law, and I believe that they have adequate
protection.
So
you don't have a problem with that in the legislation?
I had a problem with the way it was characterized in the legislation for the Supplemental Miner Act.
But you believe as a matter of law they should be protected?
I do.
Okay. You have an internal, what did you call it, BBC? Is that?
Behavior-based safety.
BBS. And that's an internal corporate policy?
That's correct.
And in your testimony, your measurements of that for us are that what you call the total incident rate from 98 to 2010 and the long-term, lost time rate has been on the overall decline. Overall, you had some ups and downs, but basically on the decline. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So how does that fit with an average of about 1,500 citations a year? Where are these two things? What's one telling us and the other's telling us?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, you have this, and you have these the safety program that's in theory on the decline by your measurements, and yet you've been cited violations that from 2005 to 2010, and running maybe the same rate this year, of about 1,500 citations a year.
Well, I think if you look at the increased inspector presence that we've had at our operation since 2006, the number of inspector shifts have gone up about 20% at our mines, as they have at most other mines. And to put that number in context, our violations per inspection day still only averaged less than 0.5, which by industry standards is very strong.
But at the end of the year, you end up with
I
an
would
average
also
of about
mention.
1,500.
I would also mention
At the end of
that-
the year, if I just finish my sentence, you end up with about 1,500 violations.
and over 4,100 inspector shifts.
So what are those 1,500 violations telling you as a company?
I think you have to look at each.
That they're all wrong, or they're the workers' fault? What are they telling you?
Well, in many cases, they're not correlated with safety issues. And I can give you a couple of examples if you'd like.
Well,
we had a number of violations that were.
in many instances, they are correlated with safety. They're about ventilation. They're about rock dust. They're about the conditions in the mine. And we can argue it either way. I'm just trying to determine, when you look at, you have your indicators and you say this is a safe operation, ought to be, essentially everybody ought to adopt this in the industry, and yet you still have and those are either because what, the inspectors aren't skilled enough, or it's the workers' fault. I mean, I'm just trying to determine how we measure the workplace.
We also look at violations as indicators of safety performance, but we take it a step further. We look at whether there was an underlying safety issue related to the violation. In one instance, we had a new inspector that came into our Mountain Laurel mine, and he had an issue with the location of an AMS sensor, an atmospheric monitoring system sensor. He had him move it a couple of feet in by. And this was a system that had been used by MSHA as a model of how to design a system in the past. And not only did he issue a violation for that one belt head, but he also issued it for every belt in the mine.
I mean, I appreciate
so in many cases,
you love the specifics.
in many
Mr. Falco.
cases, the manner in which they're enforcing the regulation.
What does the body of 1,500 citations tell you? You can pick one out, I'll pick one out. Let's just look at them and ask the question, what does that tell you? Is that consistent with your safety program? Is it inconsistent? Does that tell you about modifications that have to take place, or is it good enough?
It's an indicator that we need to look to see if there's an underlying problem. That's how we deal with it.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'd like to enter into the record with unanimous consent the Charles Scott Howard complaint, the discrimination proceedings regarding the whistleblower issue we're just talking about. And quote in it, besides Howard, at least one other pre-shift examiner had brought the leaking seals to the attention of management.
Without objection. Do we have a copy?
Yes, here it is.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rakita.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing and the committee's continued interest in this subject matter. I also want to thank the witnesses. My first question goes to Mr. Ellis. Regarding modernizing mine safety, your testimony concluded by stating that the measure of success is not the number or severity of the enforcement actions taken against mine operators, but the safety and health of the mining workforce. True?
Correct.
Given your background and experience with MSHA and the Review Commission, can you explain briefly, how the inspectors are evaluated, number one? And I'd like to know if there's a quota for violations. I have several constituents in the district that tell me stories, but you could probably put some light on it. And then, is it ever acceptable or even conceivable for an inspector to have no citations from an inspection?
Let's go last question first. Yes, it is conceivable that an inspector can go through an inspection and issue no citations. I mean, as has been discussed earlier, enforcement sometimes is a reflection of what the safety performance is at the company, but more than anything else, it focuses in on unsafe conditions. And that inspector may find that there are no unsafe conditions at that mine, and therefore you can end up with a clean inspection.
Quick follow-up, does that happen in practice?
No, as a matter of practice, in most situations, that second set of eyes from MSHA finds something. In some cases, they find more than one thing. Could I ask you to repeat the second part of your question, or the first part?
how inspectors are genuinely evaluated. You know, what makes a good inspector at MSHA?
Well, I mean, inspectors ideally have 5 years of experience in industry before they come into the inspectorate force, and then they go through training at the Mine Health and Safety Academy in Beckley, West Virginia for a couple of years, and then they move out into the field and work out in the field as inspectors. And, you know, it's a process where they move around to different operations so they get exposed to different types of conditions and different types of mines.
In your experience now, do you have any idea what percentage of MSHA inspectors actually have 5 years of experience in the industry?
I don't know, but I know that when I was at the agency, and it's still on the cusp of it, is that MSHA has a very senior workforce. A lot of the inspectors are of retirement age and they're retiring, and the agency's actively trying to recruit to backfill those positions. And so there's a culture shift that's going on with people that have had substantial experience in the industry and substantial experience as inspectors that are leaving, and we're having new people come in, and there's a learning curve there.
Thank you very much. Let me switch over to Mr. Griesemer for, did I pronounce that right? I apologize. Thank you. Kind of a follow-up to that same line of questioning, quote-unquote, the second set of eyes. I'm getting reports that one inspector will go in to a place of business and pass over something, just to make the example simple. Something hangs on the wall or something hangs on a piece of equipment, and no report that anything was a problem. A second inspector comes by weeks or months later, oh, that has to be moved, that's not right, or whatever the situation is. The company then spends a good deal of money making that correction. Now for the third inspection, it's the first inspector coming by again. Why did you move that? Put that back. And so the non-uniformity in the inspection procedure, in the policies, seems to be an issue. One area you believe MSHA could improve is training inspectors in the specific requirements of your industry. I think that was your testimony. Can you explain how aggregates maybe are different from other segments of the industry, and is this a problem in the inspection process? Do we have inspectors going to different segments of the industry, and can that be contributing to what I just explained? And I'm sorry I've given you little time to respond.
I would say yes to all of that. It was on. I think the increased frequency of inspections actually contributes to that somewhat, in that we're now seeing 100% of our 2s and 4s in the aggregates sector, and in this down economy, I have to say a lot of us small producers aren't even running 12 months a year, so it's particularly a burden for an inspector to come back. Nothing changes in 6 months in our operations compared to like an active other mine, a larger mine. We may only have 6 or 7 employees at a surface operation, and the number of inspections that they come in, and they do rotate inspectors, so there is this a new set of eyes and ears every time. Yes.
And that's good or bad? And I yield back.
Thank you.
We think the resources could be better used elsewhere.
Thank you.
Turn now to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much, and glad that we're having this hearing. As you know, several years ago, I did go down to a mine, and I really have to commend workers in the mines for the the challenge that they have, and I think they're very honorable and hardworking people. It kind of amazes me, though, that I find sometimes the mine owners have a sort of a kind of lackadaisical attitude about the protection of these hardworking Americans who really put their lives on the line. I just have a question, and as a matter of fact, believe it or not, around the world, and I've traveled to South Africa where the mine workers really were very active, even in the anti-apartheid work. Even in Zambia, the miners protested where the Chinese are really running the mines and have armed guards, and they protested, and the mine owners were even listening to them, and of course what we saw in Chile. So it seems, I still get an uncomfortable feeling about the attitude, it seems, of cavalier attitude of mine owners for these people who really jeopardize their lives so much. And let me just ask you, Mr. Roberts, about the 2 weeks ago, the Robert C. Byrd Miner Safety Protection Act was refiled. It will strengthen criminal penalties, improve protection for miners' rights, and modernize the use of technology to prevent explosions in coal mines. How should Congress go about modernizing mine safety, in your opinion, and does this bill take the proper approach?
Thank you for the question. I don't mean to be critical of anything that's been raised here today, but when we look at the situation that exists as we gather here today, and we know that 70,000 coal miners have died from pneumoconiosis in the last 40 years, and 10,000 of those died in the last decade. We know that we've seen an explosion, the worst disaster that we have seen in 40 years, just a year ago, when 29 miners lost their lives. We know in '06 that we had a terrible explosion at Sago. A couple weeks later, miners were caught in a fire and died at Aracoma. And then we saw 9 miners die, 6 instantly at Crandall Canyon and 3 trying valiantly to rescue them in '07. And whether or not the most important thing that we should be talking about is, did somebody write a citation that was consistent or inconsistent, seems to not be speaking to the fact that we know there's a coal mine right now, that I just raised, that might explode and would have exploded had MSHA not been there. That seems to be a much greater problem from my perspective than perhaps someone feeling they got treated poorly. And I apologize if that sounds harsh, and I don't mean for it to come across that way, but all you have to do is meet some of these families and talk to them, and some of these miners too. What's the most important thing we could do? Well, we could modernize what we're doing as a government. Let me give you a perfect example of that. The way we test the explosibility of coal dust, for example. You may have read this. MSHA took a sample from the Upper Big Branch mine, and the way they test those now, they send them to a lab in Mount Hope, West Virginia. They took a sample at Upper Big Branch before the explosion. 10 days after the explosion, the sample came back, and it was way out of line. And in fact, it was 80% explosible, I guess is the word that they used. So that told everyone, once the sample came back, something should be done here. But quite frankly, those of you who know anything about coal mining, you've been in a coal miner, know you can just about look and see that. If you've got coal dust all over the mine, that is like gunpowder. That's like gunpowder. And it's more explosive than methane. Methane ignites, methane explodes, and then it ignites the coal dust. You cannot have an explosion like you had at Upper Big Branch without being totally and completely out of compliance. And all the evidence suggests that. So we've had the samples come back. So we need to modernize it. Inspectors need to be armed with the ability to know what is in the atmosphere immediately in the explosive range of the coal dust that's there, whether there's enough rock dust on it. And MSHA has taken actions to try to increase those standards. But we need to act quickly and modernize the tools that MSHA has to determine these factors and to be able to deal with those when they find them. We should be about the business, I think, of making sure that we're not here next week or next year talking about this mine exploded in West Virginia or Kentucky and what do we need to do about it. And let's be honest about it. There's never been a law passed here except one time, and that was 1977, and that was revisions to the 69 Act. We would have never passed the 69 Act if we hadn't had those coal miners die at Farmington. We would have never acted in '06 if we hadn't had those miners die at Sago and Aracoma and then Darby. What has prompted every action by this Congress, not this particular Congress, but Congress itself, has been a terrible tragedy, and I think we can do better than that.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. The time has expired, and I'm glad I concurred with you in some of my opening statements on that, and I think we all agree. It's how we get to that point is the question. Turn now to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and all your witnesses. We do appreciate you being here. I come from the private sector. I'm an automobile dealer, and I think we all would agree that our main concern is making sure that whatever line of work you're in, you're doing, it's safe. And I think the danger when we have some of these hearings is that we get a polarization between those that operate a business versus those that work in these businesses. And coming from a situation where it's very important for my workers to be safe because that ensures my ability to stay in business. And when I look at this, I have been through several mines myself, and I have friends who have been from Western Pennsylvania. There is an inherent risk for going underground and working in these situations. I agree with that. I don't think there's any question about that. Then a question becomes, then, okay, can you legislate safety? Can you legislate common sense? Can you legislate practical purposes that make sense for everybody? And I think the difficulty that we have on this side of it is, how do you come up with a situation? There's a term in the military, it's called slodge. It's S-L-O-J. It's a sudden loss of judgment, where people walk into the tail rotor of a helicopter. Now, you could come up with a law that says, don't walk within an area where the helicopter is parked. There are certain things that chalking the tires on that truck are very important. In my business, they're supposed to wear a hard hat and safety glasses when they're working underside of a car. Nobody does it. That's the rule, but nobody does it. And let me ask you, because I've watched this, and I've been through OSHA inspections myself, and some of it gets to the point of, it's like a traffic violation. Well, we call them traffic violations. Maybe one for speeding, where you were going 25 in a 15-mile zone, or you're going 85 in a 50-mile zone. There's a big difference. Tell me about some of the citations, Mr. Griesmer, because I have friends who were cited, and my problem with all this is there's no remedial purpose to this. When they do an inspection, to sit down with you and say, you know, we found some problems, we think you need to address them. I mean, leaving the lid off a garbage container, to me, doesn't have the same consequences as maybe the coal dust would be. The distance of a fluorescent light from the top of a desk maybe doesn't have the same consequences in not having a safety room for people to go to. So if you could just walk us through what one of the inspections are, and do you even have the opportunity to fix what they found was wrong? And it's the inconsistency of the inspections, I think, that makes it very difficult to come up with a policy that makes sense for all of us.
Thank you, Congressman. I agree exactly with what you're saying. I've been doing this for over 30 years. There's been a big change in the way inspections have been performed in that period of time. We used to have inspectors come out to the plant, and they'd actually give safety talks to our people, which we welcomed. And there was more compliance assistance in the early years than there is today. And the emphasis has changed in the last few years to enforcement. If they see it, they write it up, and there's a penalty assessed. It's a prescriptive, somebody had mentioned that before, a prescriptive solution. I think we have to engage everybody. We've got the CEOs, the middle managers engaged. We also have to engage the workers, because we have to have their hearts and minds about safety as well. And I think we're not emphasizing enough there, because we're needing the small operators are going to have some assistance. MSHA's talking about closing the small mines office, and it's the compliance assistance that's going away, and it's the enforcement that's being emphasized over and over again. I agree with you. I think it's the wrong way to go. The instance of my truck driver not chalking the wheels, I think you could use that as an example of, we had provided the chalks, we had provided the training. The company had done everything except anticipate and tell him specifically, you get off that truck for 1 minute, you have to chalk the wheels. We want them to think about that themselves. You have to have the worker engaged in safety before those things will happen.
Okay, Mr. Roberts, do you have an opportunity to sit down then with management and go over common concerns and then come up with common answers or solutions to it? Because I think really best practices are usually the result of not only those that own the mines, but those that work in the mines. Does that opportunity exist? Because I think that would be invaluable to everyone.
It certainly does exist, particularly at unionized operations. There's a process in the contract itself that's called a labor management positive change process, where those kinds of issues are dealt with. Unionized mines have safety committees that work very closely with management, but the truth is that many of the mines in this country are non-union and the workers are unrepresented, and it's management who dictates or decides what the health and safety operations will look like and what the policies will be. So yes, at unionized mines, there is an opportunity for this kind of dialogue. We do engage in it. In fact, we not only engage in it at the local level, at the mine level, we do it at the national level also.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now we move to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Chairman Klein for having this important hearing. I also want to thank the witnesses for informing those of us who are not as familiar with these issues, and for your professionalism and civility towards one another as you testify. Mr. Chairman, I was particularly interested in the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Rokita's line of questioning, and I would yield to him such time as I may have.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman from South Carolina, a good friend and certainly a gentleman in every respect. Continuing on with my questioning of Mr. Ellis, please. In your capacity as president of the National Industrial Sand Association, are you following MSHA's regulatory agenda proposal to further regulate crystalline silica?
Yes.
Okay. Can you explain what companies are currently doing to prevent exposure to the silica, and do you believe a further reduction in the permissible exposure limit can be achieved?
Let me start out by saying crystalline silica is a technical name given to a substance that we're all familiar with, quartz or sand. And that's the substance we're talking about. But when it's in respirable size, it's potentially harmful to the human lung, and it causes disease. It causes silicosis. And everybody should appreciate that it's a preventable disease. So it's something that needs to be taken seriously. We can prevent that disease. The rulemaking that's being considered right now conceivably would look at whether we lower the level from what it currently is, to whether or not we need to add additional provisions to the law to capture overexposures and eliminate them. So yeah, we're watching that rule very carefully.
Okay, thank you. And switching over to Mr. Bumbico, I appreciate your testimony. Using a little bit of my time, is there anything you want to add to Mr. Congressman Miller's line of questioning, or do you feel like that was fully answered?
I think what I would like to add is that it's very possible, very probable that the indicators we're looking at as to what's safe and what are not safe are the wrong indicators. You know, prior to the disasters that occurred in 2006, the industry was very comfortable because the number of injuries had been trending down, the number of fatalities trending down, and I think that is what caused those disasters that proceeded to be such a shock, because we were thinking that progress was being made. In my estimation, we are looking at the wrong thing. Looking at injuries, looking at regulatory compliance is looking backwards. And what we need to be doing is looking forwards. We need to be teaching people how to identify exposures, how to identify risks, and how to deal with them.
Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. On that point, I mean, I was trying to get to this point to some extent, maybe not exactly as you said, but I represent a lot of heavy industry, oil refineries, chemical industry, steel mills, and others. And we have seen in this committee, and we saw the tragedies of British Petroleum at Texas City, where all this concentration was on trips and falls, as opposed to processes on how you're doing your job and what is it you should be thinking of when you have this specific job to do, whether it's shutting down a vessel, reworking a turnaround. And I think we're moving in that direction. And I don't want to say that it's just a matter of trips and falls in the mines, but the real question is, what is the pattern of work and what is the pattern of safety considerations for this project that we have in this vein, this type of mine, this operation? What have we done ahead of that? And what we're seeing is where industry is starting to adopt that, and many have, that it does seem to change the consciousness of everybody involved, from the management to the worker, in the sense that maybe we need additional resources.
And thank you for claiming my time, assuming you asked a question. Real quick, please.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
I think the process I'm talking about has to take place on two levels. You have to do a risk assessment at a major hazard level to look at what might cause an explosion or a fire, and also take that down to the employee level so that lesser risk could be dealt with too. And the two merge into one culture if it's done effectively.
And then finally, Mr. Mobico, the industry supported the Miner Act of 2006. It was before my time, but I understand that to be the case. But you did not support the Miner Act, and most recently the Miner Safety and Health Act. Can you explain why industry has taken two different positions on mine safety?
I don't see us as taking two different positions. I think the positions have been consistent. I think in the case of the Miner Act, the parties were able to get together and determine what the underlying changes needed to be. That wasn't the case with the Supplemental Miner Act. As I mentioned earlier, there were a number of things that were in the Miner Act that could have been done anyway by MSHA. That didn't require new legislation to enact them. At the same time, there were some provisions in there, like the definition of what was a serious and substantial violation, that would have fundamentally changed enforcement and made it very, very difficult for the industry to comply.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses. Again, I yield, Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. And I also would like to, again, thank our witnesses for taking the time to testify before the subcommittee today. It's been enlightening for us, and I appreciate the perspective that's come across the spectrum and the questioning coming from the committee. And so now I would take time to recognize the ranking member, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We were hoping for a second round of questions, so I will yield 1 minute to Congressman Payne and 1 minute to Congressman Miller if they want to say.
Well, just very quickly, maybe Mr. Roberts, the characterization of the difference between the Miner Act and why the industry opposed it. What do you think about the S-Miner? Was it such a radical, or was it the company wanted to write the act, or what's the deal?
I don't see it that way at all, and in fact, we supported that. We also support the Robert C. Byrd Act also.
Great.
1 minute? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All this business about blaming the workers, for heaven's sakes. I was a human resources director for 10 years of a high-tech manufacturing company. It was so clear to me. Now, that's not coal mining. It's not, rock mining. I know there is a difference. But the difference is that we knew as employers, as the bosses, that it was our job to put together safety policies that our employees followed. If they didn't follow it, we had disciplinary programs in place, because if you don't follow the safety rules and you're going to risk your life and anybody else's, that's a disciplinary problem. So, and we also had really, doesn't sound like it when I'm going on and on like this, but we had really good employee-employer relations. That makes a difference. We had a safety committee. We had 800 employees, so it's not like we had 12 people. And, you can do it. And you cannot blame the worker. You can't blame the worker when the worker, we had suggestion boxes. If the person that had those seals knew about the water seals or anything close to it, couldn't get through their manager or to their bosses, they'd have put it in the suggestion box. Somebody would have heard it and cared about it. So, if you want to modernize, then these industries have to join the 21st century and work with their employees. And you want partnerships, it's the employer-employee partnership. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We've built a foundation through numerous hearings and several Congresses for the overdue mine safety reform legislation. And last year, under Chairman Miller's leadership, we brought reform legislation to the floor following consultation with the upper Big Branch miners and their families. And the mining industry, academics, state mine safety regulators, the Inspector General, and many, many others. It's not like we did this in a vacuum. Regrettably, opponents of the bill argued that it was premature to act before the investigations have been completed at Upper Big Branch. Well, this is a misleading argument because after conducting its investigation for over a year, MSHA persuasively argues that it knows enough about the accidents to justify making immediate changes to the Mine Act. So we can keep throwing challenges in the way or we can prevent future accidents. That's up to us. I agree with Mr. Roberts. We can keep talking about this until another accident happens, or we can act on it. And I want to act on it with you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
I thank the gentlelady, and I would certainly concur that we want to act. We want to act appropriately. We want to act with reason, and we want to act with common sense. Though that may not be so common anymore in the world today. We want to certainly not blame workers unnecessarily. We don't want to blame the employers and the mine owners and the operators unnecessarily either. We want to encourage, and I give credit to workers for good sense and for good experience that can expand our capabilities of moving forward in this area. I think that's the reason for hearings like this, and hearings that I would assure you, with all good intentions of moving forward in the appropriate fashion to make sure that, number one, we have a safe workplace for our mine workers. But we also have a workplace for our mine workers that will go on with some security and that will encourage that honorable profession to continue for as long as we need the product. I certainly remember my experience as a United Steel worker, working at the U.S. Steel South Works south side of Chicago. I certainly understand the impact of having union and management work together. I certainly understand the frustrations that were there at times. I certainly understand being a steel worker, working on a mold platform or working on the platform related to the steel heat itself, and having the experience of coming back to a plant, fortunately, after having left it during a shift and not seeing the locker room there anymore because heat had burned through the furnace and gone into the sewage system. That was not as a result of lack of regulation. That was not as a result of desire to cut corners by the company. That was certainly not the result of union workers desiring that lack of safety to take place. Unfortunately, no life was lost because it was between shifts. It was operator error, clearly at that point. How we protect against that goes with good regulation, good training, and again, common sense and care taken by employee and employer. So our purpose is to move that direction. I appreciate the testimony we've heard today. I appreciate seeing technology that can be used to foster improvement in the health and safety of our workers. And we certainly, as a subcommittee and ultimately as a full committee, want to deal with that appropriate fashion. I know that there is further opportunity for giving input. That has been left open at the beginning of this hearing here for further information to be shared. This subcommittee is open to that. Want to have that as part of a record. So having said that, there being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.